Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on two stories that expose a fundamental tension in our world, the tension between institutions that claim to fight corruption and the corruption that festers within those very institutions.
And I'm Maya Clarity. From Kuala Lumpur to Sydney, we're tracking how power protects itself, whether that's an anti-corruption chief accused of the very crimes he's supposed to investigate, or a foreign government allegedly trying to silence artistic expression on Australian soil. These stories are connected by a single thread: accountability.
We're going to take you deep into the details tonight, because the details are where the truth lives. In Malaysia, the man tasked with rooting out graft is now the subject of calls for a royal commission. Think about that for a moment, the nation's top corruption fighter, under investigation.
And in Sydney, the chief executive of one of Australia's premier theatre companies is standing firm against what he calls outrageous threats aimed at shutting down performances by Shen Yun, the Chinese dance group that Beijing has long targeted. We'll unpack who's behind those threats and what it means for free expression in a democracy.
So stay with us. This is Truth Report, and tonight, we're following the money, the power, and the pressure. Let's get into it.
We begin in Malaysia, where Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim is facing mounting pressure from both critics and allies to address serious allegations against the head of the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, known as the MAC. According to reporting from the South China Morning Post, the government said on Friday it would consider calls for a royal commission of inquiry to investigate alleged abuses of power within the agency.
Let's set the stage here. The MAC is Malaysia's primary anti-graft body. It is the institution that Malaysians are supposed to trust to keep their government clean. And at the top of that institution sits Chief Commissioner Azam Baki, who has been engulfed in controversy since news reports earlier this month alleged that he purchased corporate shares exceeding the limits permitted for civil servants. We're talking about stock transactions that, if confirmed, would represent a direct violation of the rules that govern public officials.
And Alex, this isn't the first time Azam Baki's name has surfaced in controversy. He's faced questions before about his asset declarations and financial dealings. But what makes this moment different is the breadth of the coalition calling for accountability. This isn't just the opposition piling on, members of Anwar Ibrahim's own governing coalition are demanding action. When your own allies are publicly calling for your appointee's head, you know the pressure has reached a critical threshold.
Exactly right. And let's talk about the mechanism being proposed here, a royal commission of inquiry. In Malaysia's legal and political framework, a royal commission is one of the most powerful investigative tools available. It has the authority to compel testimony, subpoena documents, and issue findings that carry enormous political and moral weight. The fact that this is even being discussed tells you how serious the allegations have become.
The South China Morning Post reports that the government is weighing this option carefully. And there's a reason for that caution. Setting up a royal commission to investigate your own anti-corruption agency is, in effect, an admission that the watchdog itself may be compromised. That's not a small thing for any government to acknowledge, least of all one that came to power on a reform platform.
And that's the crux of the political dilemma for Anwar Ibrahim. He swept into office promising to clean up Malaysian governance after the massive 1MDB scandal that brought down his predecessor Najib Razak. Anwar's entire political identity is built on the promise of transparency and accountability. So when the head of his anti-corruption agency is accused of corruption, it strikes at the very foundation of his mandate.
Let's dig into the share trading allegations specifically. Malaysian civil service rules place strict limits on the types and volumes of corporate shares that government officials can hold. These rules exist for obvious reasons, to prevent conflicts of interest, insider trading, and the kind of self-dealing that erodes public trust. The allegations against Azam Baki suggest that these limits were not merely bent but broken outright.
And here's what makes this particularly damaging. The MAC is the body that investigates other officials for exactly this kind of financial misconduct. If its own chief is engaging in prohibited share trading, it raises devastating questions about every investigation the Commission has conducted, every case it has declined to prosecute, and every official it has cleared. The integrity of the entire anti-corruption apparatus comes into question.
That's the institutional damage we're talking about. It's not just about one man's stock portfolio. It's about whether Malaysia's anti-corruption infrastructure can be trusted at all. And for a country that is still recovering from the 1MDB scandal, one of the largest kleptocracy cases in world history, involving billions of dollars siphoned from a state investment fund, the stakes could not be higher.
Let's talk about who benefits from this situation and who loses. The obvious losers are ordinary Malaysians who depend on the MAC to hold powerful people accountable. If the commission is compromised at the top, it creates a chilling effect throughout the entire system. Whistleblowers think twice. Investigators pull their punches. Cases that should be pursued quietly die on someone's desk.
And the beneficiaries? They're the politically connected elites who have always operated in Malaysia's grey zones, the businesspeople with government contracts, the politicians with unexplained wealth, the fixers who move between the public and private sectors. Every day that the MAC's credibility is in question is a day that those actors can operate with less scrutiny. A compromised watchdog is, functionally, no watchdog at all.
There's also a broader regional dimension here. Malaysia has been positioning itself as a governance leader in Southeast Asia, a region where corruption remains endemic in many countries. If Malaysia can't keep its own anti-corruption house in order, it weakens the reform argument across the entire region. Other governments can point to Kuala Lumpur and say, see, even the reformers can't make it work.
And the pressure for Azam Baki's immediate removal, not just investigation, but removal, tells you that many in Malaysia's political class understand the urgency. A prolonged investigation with Azam Baki still in his post would mean months, potentially years, of the MAC operating under a cloud. Every prosecution, every raid, every public statement from the commission would be met with questions about the chief's own conduct.
Prime Minister Anwar faces a defining choice. Move swiftly, establish the Royal Commission, and demonstrate that no one is above the law, including the people who enforce it. Or equivocate, delay, and risk being seen as just another politician who talks about reform but protects the powerful when it counts. His legacy may well turn on what he does in the coming weeks.
We'll be watching that story closely. Now, let's turn to Sydney, Australia, where a different kind of power struggle is unfolding, one that involves art, geopolitics, and the question of whether a foreign government can dictate what performances take place on Australian stages.
According to The Guardian, Graham Kearns, the chief executive of Foundation Theatres, the company that operates the Capitol Theatre in Sydney, is refusing to be intimidated by what he calls outrageous threats connected to the upcoming performances of Shen Yun. For those unfamiliar, Shen Yun Performing Arts is a New York-based dance company founded in 2006 that performs classical Chinese dance and music. It was established by practitioners of Falun Gong, the spiritual movement that has been brutally persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party since 1999.
And that's where the story gets geopolitically complicated. Beijing has long viewed Shen Yun as a propaganda vehicle for Falun Gong, and the Chinese government has waged a global campaign to shut down the company's performances wherever they occur. We're talking about documented cases of Chinese diplomatic pressure on theaters, venues, and local governments across North America, Europe, and the Asia-Pacific region. This isn't speculation, it's a pattern that has been reported on extensively for years.
So when Graham Kearns says he won't be intimidated, he's pushing back against a well-established playbook. The Guardian reports that threats were made in connection with Shen Yun Sydney performances, and while the specific nature of those threats deserves careful examination, Kearns's response was unequivocal. He said, and I want to quote this directly, "Our job in theater is to absolutely defend the right to tell stories about culture."
That's a powerful statement, and it cuts to the heart of what's at stake here. This isn't just about one dance show in one city. It's about whether foreign governments can exercise veto power over cultural expression in democratic countries. And it's about the broader pattern of what security researchers call transnational repression, the practice of authoritarian regimes reaching beyond their borders to silence dissent, suppress criticism, and control narratives.
Let's unpack the corporate dimension here, because this is Truth Report and we follow the money. Foundation Theatres is a significant commercial entity in Australia's performing arts ecosystem. The Capitol Theatre is one of Sydney's premier venues. When a company like Foundation Theatres takes a stand on this issue, it's making a business calculation as well as a principled one. They're saying that the revenue from Shen Yun performances and, more broadly, their reputation as a venue that won't bow to political pressure, outweighs whatever economic consequences might come from angering Beijing.
And those economic consequences are real. China is Australia's largest trading partner. The relationship between Canberra and Beijing has been turbulent in recent years, with trade disputes, diplomatic freezes, and sharp disagreements over everything from the origins of COVID-19 to security arrangements in the Pacific. Australian businesses that cross Beijing's red lines have faced consequences, from wine tariffs to barley duties to coal import bans. So Kearns's stance isn't cost-free.
But here's what makes his position so important. Every time a venue capitulates to pressure and cancels a Shen Yun performance, and this has happened in multiple countries, it sends a signal that intimidation works. It validates the strategy. And it emboldens not just Beijing but every authoritarian government that wants to control what its diaspora communities can see, hear, and experience abroad.
The Shen Yun situation also raises questions about Australia's foreign interference laws. In 2018, Australia passed some of the world's toughest foreign interference legislation, partly in response to concerns about Chinese Communist Party influence operations. Those laws were designed to protect Australian sovereignty and democratic processes from covert foreign pressure. If the threats against Foundation theatres have any connection to a foreign state actor, they could potentially fall within the scope of those laws.
And that's a critical point. Australia didn't pass those laws as a symbolic gesture. They were a response to documented cases of foreign influence in Australian politics, media, and academia. If those laws can't protect a theatre company from threats connected to a foreign government's campaign against a dance troupe, then what exactly are they for?
Let's talk about who benefits and who loses in this situation. The immediate beneficiaries of Kearns's stance are the performers of Shen Yun themselves, many of whom are members of the Falun Gong community. For them, every successful performance is an act of cultural survival, a way of keeping alive artistic traditions and spiritual practices that the Chinese government has spent 2 decades trying to eradicate.
The broader beneficiaries are all Australians who value free expression. Because if a foreign government can shut down a dance performance today, the precedent is set for shutting down a documentary tomorrow, or a book launch next week, or an academic conference next month. The principle of artistic freedom doesn't protect only art we agree with, it protects the entire ecosystem of open expression.
And the losers? In the short term, Beijing loses a battle in its global campaign against Shen Yun. But the more significant losers are the communities caught in the middle, Chinese Australians who may face pressure from both directions, asked to choose between their cultural ties to China and their commitment to the democratic values of their adopted home. Transnational repression doesn't just silence dissidents. It fractures communities.
There's also a corporate governance angle here that deserves attention. Kearns is making this decision as a CEO, not as a politician or an activist. He's answerable to a board, to shareholders, to commercial partners. The fact that he's choosing to speak publicly and forcefully about this issue suggests he's confident that the business case for standing firm is stronger than the business case for capitulating. And that confidence may reflect a broader shift in how Australian companies think about the risks of engaging with authoritarian pressure.
We've seen similar shifts in other sectors. Australian universities, which were heavily criticized for self-censoring to protect Chinese student enrollment revenue, have begun pushing back more assertively on academic freedom issues. Media companies that once tread carefully around Beijing's sensitivities are now reporting more aggressively on Chinese influence operations. There may be a tipping point at which the reputational cost of appearing to bow to foreign pressure exceeds the commercial cost of standing up to it.
And Kearns seems to understand that his decision resonates beyond his own venue. By speaking to The Guardian and using language like outrageous threats and framing his role as defending the right to tell cultural stories, he's not just managing a PR situation, he's making a statement about what Australian institutions should stand for. That's leadership.
Now, Alex, let's pull these two stories together, because on the surface they might seem unrelated, an anti-corruption scandal in Malaysia and a theatre threat in Australia. But I think the connections run deeper than they first appear.
Absolutely. Both stories are fundamentally about institutional integrity, about whether the organizations and systems we depend on to uphold our values are actually doing their job. In Malaysia, the institution is the MAC, and the question is whether an anti-corruption body can function when its leader is accused of corruption. In Australia, the institutions are the theatres and the legal frameworks that are supposed to protect free expression, and the question is whether they can withstand external pressure.
And in both cases, we see the same dynamic at work, powerful actors attempting to operate above or beyond the rules that are supposed to govern everyone equally. Ozambaki allegedly trading shares in violation of civil service rules. A foreign government allegedly threatening an Australian business for hosting a performance it doesn't like. In both cases, the message is the same: rules are for other people.
There's also a common thread around the courage of individuals. In Malaysia, it's the journalists and politicians who are pushing for the Royal Commission despite the political risks. In Australia, it's Graham Kearns standing in front of cameras and saying he won't be intimidated. These stories remind us that institutions don't defend themselves, people defend them, often at personal and professional cost.
And both stories highlight the gap between rhetoric and reality. Malaysia talks about fighting corruption. Australia talks about defending free expression and resisting foreign interference. But talk is cheap. The test of any commitment is what happens when it becomes expensive, when defending your principles means taking on powerful interests, absorbing political damage, or facing economic consequences.
What strikes me is that both stories also reveal how interconnected the global system has become. Malaysia's anti-corruption framework exists partly because of international pressure and global governance norms. Australia's foreign interference laws exist partly because of the globalization of authoritarian influence operations. We're living in a world where domestic integrity depends on international vigilance, and vice versa.
And for the corporate world specifically, and this is our beat here at Truth Report, both stories send a clear message. corporate governance failures at the MAC created an environment where the chief could allegedly operate outside the rules. In Sydney, a corporation is being tested on whether its commitment to values can withstand geopolitical pressure. In both cases, the corporate dimension is central to the story.
That's exactly right. And that brings us to the question we always come back to on this show: who is watching the watchers? In Malaysia, the answer was supposed to be the MAC. But when the watcher is compromised, you need a watcher for the watcher, hence the calls for a royal commission. It's an infinite regress that only stops when someone, somewhere, has the courage to demand accountability.
In Australia, the watchers are supposed to be the legal system, the media, and the democratic institutions that protect free expression. Kearns is, in a sense, calling on those systems to do their job, to take the threats seriously, to investigate their origins, and to ensure that the legal protections on the books are actually enforced. A law that isn't enforced is just words on paper.
So what should our audience take away from tonight? First, pay attention to institutional integrity, not just in other countries, but in your own. The health of anti-corruption bodies, of free expression protections, of corporate governance frameworks, these things directly affect your life, your economy, and your freedoms. Don't take them for granted.
Second, support the people who take stands. Graham Kearns is taking a stand in Sydney. The journalists and politicians pushing for accountability in Malaysia are taking a stand. These individuals face real consequences for their actions. At minimum, they deserve public attention and support.
Third, follow the patterns. Tonight we covered two stories from two different countries, and the underlying dynamics were remarkably similar. That's not a coincidence. Power operates the same way everywhere: it seeks to avoid accountability, to silence criticism, and to operate above the rules. Recognizing that pattern is the first step to resisting it.
And finally, demand more from the institutions that are supposed to serve you. Whether it's an anti-corruption commission, a foreign interference law, or a corporate governance framework, these systems are only as strong as the people who insist they work. Complacency is corruption's greatest ally.
Well said, Maya. That's our show for tonight. We'll continue tracking both of these stories in the days and weeks ahead. The Royal Commission question in Malaysia and the ongoing situation with Shen Yun performances in Australia, these are developing stories with significant implications.
If you found tonight's reporting valuable, share it. Talk about it. The stories we covered tonight, about compromised watchdogs and threatened theaters, they matter because they're about the systems that protect all of us. And those systems only work when people pay attention.
For Truth Report, I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay informed, stay critical, and we'll see you next time.
Good night.